Discussions around Alatra in Slovakia and the Czech Republic are not ceasing. In the previous video, I told you about who needed to launch a massive discrediting attack against Alatra International Public Movement, which is engaged in studying the climate, the rapid increase of cataclysms on Earth, in delivering information about it to the general public, and why this attack was launched. Let me remind you that in just 3 weeks, about 400 publications were released in various mass media of Europe. Even a layman who barely looked at the identical headlines of those articles, identical wording, and the most primitive copywriting can clearly see that this attack in the media has been ordered. I already showed the facts and the chain of links that led us to the organizers and sponsors of this slanderous campaign in Slovakia and the Czech Republic. It is the Russian pro-religious organization RACIRS, operating under the patronage of the Russian Orthodox Church. For more details, follow the link and watch the video. Yet now I would like to mention an article on Seznam Zprávy portal, which was recently released by Ms. Sirokova, that very scandalous Czech journalist who was involved in a criminal case on the suppression of fundamental human rights and freedoms. First of all, I will voice an interesting fact. Quite recently, we received a notice that narratives were sent through communication channels of the Russian pro-religious organization RACIRS with instructions to link Alatra's activities to extremism in the eyes of the public. Before we even had time to realize this information, this very narrative was immediately promoted by RACIRS talking head here in the Czech Republic. In the above-mentioned article by Ms. Sirokova, there is a reference to the opinion of a certain political expert where Alatra is accused of using the tools of Russian propaganda, extremism, and radicalism. It is said that due to our allegedly radical and aggressive rhetoric, there might be some individuals who may be incited to extreme actions, the so-called lone wolves or lone shooters. So this unknown expert mentioned in the article is concerned about a corresponding security threat. Thus, narratives of the pro-religious organization RACIRS, whose ideological center is supervised by the Russian Orthodox Church, are now appearing in the Czech media. Doesn't this give you a certain hint? Compare the facts and ponder. Who is actually carrying out the Russian disinformation? The said expert calls us pro-Kremlin. While this whole massive defamation campaign through media agents recruited by the Russian RACIRS uses identical rhetoric since the very first dehumanizing publications about Alatra, released on ROC portals 10 years ago. Let's take another look at these screenshots. The rhetoric is identical, although the articles were published 10 years apart and in different countries, the Czech Republic and Russia. So who is actually pro-Kremlin here, dear journalists? Speaking of extremism, radicalism, and aggressive rhetoric that sets people up for radical sentiments, let's see. Who actually uses it? Just note how these RACIRS supporters do not only spread Russian disinformation here in a democratic European state, but also use manipulation tools favored by the so-called anti-cult groups. Everything is identical to what was done during the Nazi era. Identical methods are used against other organizations dehumanized and stigmatized as sects and cults by the Russian pro-religious organization RACIRS. The same approach is applied against us. Back then, there was Walter Kunith, who founded an apologetics center and taught dehumanization methods not only to his entire network of agents under the guise of anti-cult activities, but also to the Nazis. Nowadays, the new Führer, Dvorkin, the main ideologist of RACIRS, instructs his entire network of agents just like Knuth did, and he purposefully uses the same vivid and emotionally charged narratives that evoke certain images and associations in your mind. It is always children, sex, violence, extremism, and terrorism. These are completely different organizations, religious and secular ones, and people who have nothing to do with religion at all. But they are accused of the same things: rape, sex scandals, and child abuse. And here you can see propaganda aimed at dehumanizing the Jewish people during the formation of Nazism. Do you see the similarities? These are methods of manipulation. Why? Because your brain reacts to this information. You hear about sex and you're jealous that someone is better than you. They have it, while you don't. Hence, you subconsciously have a desire to rise above that person, to be superior to him, while in fact, at this time, you are already being manipulated and brainwashed. Envy is the easiest trigger to get you hooked. First, they show why you live so badly, then they find the culprits. Look, these people are bad, and you don't have what they have. Thus, they ignite envy in you and push you to do mean deeds. And then they make you feel superior to those people. So now you feel justified to take everything away from them. Whether it's Nazism or communism, this manipulation technique is the same everywhere. The only format where there was no such manipulation was democracy. RACIRS agents have been using the same manipulation methods in politics and everywhere else. They are trying to divide society into educated and uneducated people. We also received a notice that the Russian pro-religious organization RACIRS and its agents launched a narrative that Allatra is backed by the intellectual elite and only smart, literate, and educated people join us. So one of the key Czech anti-cultists immediately started talking about the same thing. Look at this quote from an interview with Zdeněk Vojtěšek, who hasn't published anything about Allatra for a long time, although he was one of the first to drag the movement into the religious field. And it is very likely that he contributed to the rhetoric of the Russian pro-religious organization RACIRS penetrating into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. After his actions, mass media in these countries began to stigmatize Allatra as allegedly a sect. Why do anti-cultists and their accomplices promote this narrative? It seems to me that this is done to increase polarization and division in society. RACIRS' agents are afraid that we are telling the truth and that we will be understood by people with critical thinking who are able to correlate cause and effect. Therefore, those agents try to divide and radicalize society. But what for? In order to aggravate the cleavage. In the past century, such a division in society was already instigated based on the very same principles. They raised working people against the intellectual elites. It seems that using rhetoric similar to that of Mr. Vojtěšek, they want to apply the same approach in our times. Meanwhile, we know for sure that people with sound minds are able to compare facts and comprehend the truth. In fact, we have a lot of participants who are engaged in both intellectual and hard physical work. And they perceive information no worse than those who have graduated from several universities. Why? Because nature has endowed a human with intelligence. Anyone can develop it if they desire. Hard work isn't an obstacle to intellectual development. We are against humiliation of people, especially working people. We are against division and dehumanization because we ourselves are working people, first and foremost. So you should think and analyze when you hear such narratives and remember that you are being programmed and that completely different mindsets are being imposed on you. Until you regain critical thinking, you will always be open to these manipulations. Now let's go back to the lone wolves mentioned in Ms. Tsirokova's article. So, the expert invited by Tsirokova claims that our rhetoric can radicalize people. You know, I'm accustomed to various provocations by anti-cultists and their accomplices, but here even I was struck by the highest degree of cynicism of the authors of this text. They literally harass us through the media, create an atmosphere of hatred, evoke aggression in people, and then they blame it on us, those who had to start defending ourselves from their attacks, and who weren't afraid to tell the truth about their activities. It's a classic manipulative technique of mirror accusations. They accuse their victim of exactly what they do themselves. We, the law-abiding citizens, who point out specific illegal actions of an entire organized network of agents and information terrorists, suddenly turn out to be radicals, while those who engage in harassment and manipulation against us act as alleged victims of our rhetoric. But I'm even glad that Ms. Tsirokova brought up this topic because I have a lot to say about it. I will start with a few questions. Firstly, is Ms. Expert aware of what scheme she has become an accomplice to, and which specific articles of the criminal code cover her expert cooperation with Ms. Tsirokova, an outright agent of RACIRS influence in the Czech Republic? Moreover, who is actually the author of these words included in the article? Didn't Ms. Tsirokova herself slip a ready text to this lady expert with the wording she wanted her to voice? It would be very convenient for Tsirokova to frame another person and stay clean herself, especially when law enforcement agencies already have questions for her, right? Let's call things by their proper names. What Tsirokova and her other accomplices are doing is not honest and objective journalism. It's a methodical and well-planned system for inciting hatred, increasing division in society, instigating and even programming people to commit violence. Such agents are certainly very well aware of what kind of rhetoric can push certain people with label psyche, influenced by specific subliminal implants, to commit attacks. Because they are experts in this field, and a huge number of people have already suffered at their hands. They have unlimited resources for that, access to mass media, tools enabling them to act legally under the banner of freedom of speech. And obviously they have sponsors and powerful patrons who cover their asses. And most importantly, they are armed with very serious methods of hidden psychological influence and programming of people's behavior to perform specific actions. What is more, unlike the words of Ms. Tsirokova and her expert, my words are supported with facts. Look at their scheme of operation, and you will see specific patterns yourselves. First, they publish pseudo-expert articles loaded with hidden subliminal implants. Then they publicize personal data of their victims. And then they are waiting. They are waiting for people whom they programmed to attack. They know perfectly well what triggers to use, which words to choose, and how to formulate the text in order to maximize the impact on the reader's psyche. That's not a happenstance. That's not emotions. It is cold-blooded logic. Comments under their articles such as, "Let's break the cultist's face," or "cultists should be treated with shooting," aren't spontaneous surges of aggression, but a result of their manipulations. They know what they are doing. They see those comments and keep publicizing new materials, new personal addresses, and new targets. Their methods have been well tested over years. It's a style of serial killers who kill with other people's hands. Their supervisors from RACIRS provided them with advanced Nazi technology for manipulating people's minds and subconsciousness. But even Nazis didn't do it so meanly. While these scums are hiding behind the mask of independent journalism and freedom of speech, meanwhile, their every article is a coded instruction for violence. Their every material is a delayed terrorist attack. That's how they provoke people to commit attempts on politicians, and that's how they force children to go and kill other children by instigating new cases of school shootings. Let me give you a vivid example of how the same Czech and Slovak journalists who are now hounding us and who have already written 400 demonizing publications against us, how they actually organized an attempt on the Prime Minister of Slovakia, Robert Fico. It is worth paying tribute to Mr. Fico because he is probably the first high-level politician who became deeply aware of the threat posed by journalists like Čirokova and media resources that regularly use Nazi methods from RACIRS, and began to take concrete steps to neutralize the threat they pose to the entire Slovak nation. Unfortunately, it ended in an assassination attempt on him, which clearly demonstrates how far they are willing to go. So far, reveling in impunity. Let's examine some of the details of those events. As far as I can tell, based on the information about the methods of covert manipulation described in the Impact documentary, the mechanism for preparing a terrorist attack against Mr. Fico was launched long before the shots were fired. The attempt on his life was preceded by a long informational and psychological campaign for a long time. The same media, in particular RTVS, as well as individual journalists, systematically criticized Fico and his activities, discredited and even demonized him. Naturally, Ms. Čirokova also took part in that campaign, although it would seem, why would a Czech journalist care about internal affairs in Slovakia? How did the events unfold? By an amazing coincidence, shortly after Fico raised the issue of abolishing one of the media outlets, namely the RTVS broadcasting company, for its harmful activities in the country, an attempt on the life of Prime Minister Fico followed. Indeed, it could have been a mere coincidence. But there is testimony of the shooter himself. Just a few hours after the arrest, while already in the police station, the attacker Julius Streicher, by the way, a 71-year-old elderly man, when he was asked about the motivation for his action, he replied that he disagreed with the Prime Minister's policy, specifically with the abolition of RTVS, which prompted him to kill Fico. Here is the key point. In the video where the shooter's response was recorded, you can see that he still hasn't recovered from the incident. Being under stress, being disoriented and poorly controlling his state, Streicher mechanically gives out the closest wording of what's predominating in his mind.
Nesúhlasím s politikou vlády.
A preto ste sa pred mesiacom rozhodol čo?
Veď sú likvidované mass media. Prečo RTVS je napadaná? Prečo som India Mazad je prečo vyhodený z funkcie?
Does this look like a conscious, logically reasoned or meaningful speech by a man who is confident in his words and in what he has done? No. He looks more like an autopilot that gives out the wording embedded in his mind. Let's analyze the absurdity of the situation in general. A 71-year-old man goes to commit murder and deliberate suicide, allegedly because of the closure of a TV channel. After all, he understood that the Prime Minister was guarded, so there was a high probability that they could fire back. Thus, an elderly man in his old age committed a crime, the outcome of which is either prison or death, just because of a TV channel. What is the sacrifice for? Did he protect his own interests in this way? This is contrary to any logic or common sense. This contradicts even the basic instinct of self-preservation. However, a programmed executor in whose consciousness a certain code has been embedded, will act contrary to logic, common sense, and even the instinct of self-preservation. It is noteworthy that Mr. Fico himself, barely recovering from the assassination attempt, immediately pointed to the anti-government media being among those responsible for the attack. His subconsciousness clearly identified the source of threat. As a victim of an assassination attempt, he instinctively determined where the blow came from. But even Fico himself, being an experienced politician, could not fully reveal the entire scheme. Why? Because we are all used to looking for simple correlations. Someone gives a command, and an executor goes and shoots. However, the scheme worked differently in this case, through an indirect remote impact. It's like a radio-controlled bomb. You see an explosion and a man with a detonator, but you don't see radio waves transmitting the signal. In this case, it's basically the same. The clue to unraveling the situation is in the attacker's first words said immediately after he was arrested. It wasn't just an explanation of his motive. It was a fragment of the code of a triggered program embedded in his subconsciousness through special publications that contain hidden subliminal implants and coded triggers. In a state of stress and disorientation, the man voiced exactly what manipulators had embedded in his psyche. He was just a tool in the hands of those who had been preparing this assassination attempt for a long time through manipulations hidden in media publications. While the real organizers of the assassination attempt remained in the shadows and sacrificed the life of a living man in their game. Another proof that there was remote subliminal coding through the media is that attempts to assassinate Fico didn't stop. First, he received an envelope with a bullet, which is an outright threat. After a while, a second assassination attempt was made. And again, the behavior of the second attacker, the lone wolf as they say, is quite remarkable. Not seeing anything around him, fueled with hatred, as if hypnotized, he tried to get to Fico right through the metal detector with a firearm. Again, we see no assessment of the situation, no instinct of self-preservation, and no logic. He was just moving straight to the target, like a homing missile. I'm surely not an expert, but it seems to me these are characteristic features of a person under external control, when their own will is totally suppressed by an implanted program. New threats and the second attempt on Mr. Fico are actually direct evidence that a killer coding program was launched through the information field. It's like casting a fishing net. Sooner or later, a person with a certain type of psyche, politically motivated, susceptible to suggestion and manipulation, gets into the net. The most terrible thing is that this net keeps working. And it's impossible to estimate how many more people got into it, and how many of them are already programmed and waiting for an activation signal. In fact, it's not difficult to get convinced of what I'm saying. It's enough for objective specialists who have no connection to anti-cultists to perform a retrospective examination of the mental state of both lone wolves who tried to kill Fico. And it will become clear who trained them and gave the command to attack. Human memory is unique, and our brain is a perfect recorder. It captures everything. Every word you read, every video you watch, and every idea instilled from the outside. Working with a person's memory, professional researchers can accurately track the entire chain. It's like a computer code, and experts can sort it out line by line. When and after which publication the idea of an assassination attempt arose. After which publications it was reinforced, and what served as a trigger that launched the embedded program for execution. Thus, it is possible to restore the full picture of how consciousness was programmed turning an ordinary retired man into a remotely controlled killer. When investigators begin to unravel this tangle, they will inevitably come to the original source, to those media outlets that launched the program of Robert Fico's murder. And the original source will be specific media, that's for sure. After all, a person's beliefs are formed by information that comes from the outside. Those who carry out such operations are well aware that it is the incoming information that makes a person who he is, especially the information which penetrates into the depths of subconsciousness. It transforms a person to such an extent that he starts being guided by externally instilled attitudes, being absolutely sure that it's his own conscious choice and not realizing that he is manipulated. There were simply no other sources for Fico's attacker. The man didn't know his victim personally and had no contact with him. Where did his overwhelming hatred originate? Only from those media reports that, day after day, had been methodically embedding a hate program in his mind. They were creating a picture, as if from puzzle pieces. So his entire motivation was artificially formed by manipulators from the media. Every step of such remote programming of a person to commit a terrorist attack can be proven. Most importantly, it is possible to prove the intentional manner of such programming. I have a feeling that if relevant strings are pulled, it will turn out that all the organizers of the assassination attempt on Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico are directly or indirectly connected with the Russian pro-religious organization RACIRS and its leader, Vorkin. Then everything will fall into place, and it will finally be proven that the ideologists of the entire RACIRS network of agents are actually the ones who arm their agents of influence with methods to remotely create lone wolves, mentioned in Shirokova's article, and to direct them at a given target. Clearly, they don't want their entire network to be exposed, which is why they are trying to pin blame on us. They are trying to put their wolf skins onto us. For this very reason, this whole pack of journalists was so fussed immediately after the assassination attempt on Fico, trying to get the case reclassified from a terrorist attack to a premeditated murder attempt. It's because, despite all their secrecy, they are afraid that sooner or later their scheme will be uncovered, and they will be held accountable as required by the law. Many people may wonder, why has a political leader with a pronounced pro-Russian position become a target of the Russian RACIRS? Everything is simple. I'll explain. This is extremely beneficial to RACIRS' ideologists for deepening division among Slovak people. Just as at one time it was beneficial for them to overthrow the pro-Russian president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, in order to deepen divisions in society and radicalize it. After all, when the majority of people vote for a pro-Russian Fico, choosing him as a representative of their interests, and then he is killed, it is logical that this will eventually provoke hatred among the majority towards the pro-Western minority. This in turn will result in escalation of tensions in the country and create conditions for conflicts and chaos up to an armed conflict, as it happened in Ukraine. This is extremely beneficial to the ideologists of RACIRS for eventually influencing the integrity and stability of the entire European Union. This is the same well-tested and proven method, for they are masters of manipulating fear and controlling chaos. I'll repeat once again. Do fact-checking, make an expert examination, and verify it all. It is not difficult to prove everything I have voiced. It is necessary to involve sensible specialists who understand how to properly carry out this kind of psychological examination of those who have committed an assassination attempt. Law enforcement agencies should be dealing with this already now. Because as long as this factory that produces controlled killers operates, as long as this system of media programming is in force, we will witness new assassination attempts, such as those on Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico and on U.S. President Donald Trump, as well as new school shootings and mass shootings. By the way, just to add, go ahead and count how many articles Ms. Chirokova has already written on the topic of school shootings. Read them and pay attention to the dates and the fact that almost all of them criticize the government and law enforcement. And try to find a reasonable explanation for yourselves how such a maniacal interest in this topic could be justified. They are not journalists. They are mind manipulators who purposefully create killers. They are worse than ordinary killers. A maniac kills with his own hands, while these scums create executors who do not even realize that they are controlled. The worst thing is that they keep doing it while knowing the results, seeing the consequences, and realizing that their actions cause physical violence. They keep doing what they do because it's a part of their more large-scale strategy of creating controlled chaos. So now these wolves are trying to blame us for what they are doing themselves. In fact, in any court, it will be easy to prove the connection of all these journalists with Dworkin, and accordingly with his teachers, all the way down to Kunith, who made Nazism the way we know it. It is also easily provable that it is precisely Kunith's ideas and methods that are now being used by RACIRS' agents in the Czech Republic, against Prime Minister Fico in Slovakia, and against President Trump in the United States. Those Nazi methods, adjusted to modern conditions and applied by RACIRS ideologists and their network of agents for manipulating people's minds, are only comparable in destructiveness to weapons of mass destruction. To some extent, they even surpass such weapons since they are used covertly and make it possible to freely and remotely select victims, which results in sufferings of a huge number of people. These very methods allow RACIRS ideologists to successfully achieve their goals and objectives, while remaining undetected. Radicalism, extremism, and aggressive rhetoric. They shift what they themselves are doing onto us. Moreover, saying that they allegedly face a security threat. But we've never been involved in such things, because we do not have access to press or other mass media. Unlike them, we have never used hidden methods of manipulation and influence on consciousness. We always called for peace and for paying attention to the climate. We haven't touched any one of those who are now harassing Allatra. We haven't harmed anyone. It's not us who started it all. We have always called for maintaining critical thinking, for the need to keep track of one's thoughts, of what comes to one's consciousness and how, and what emotions arise after specific thoughts. We've always stood for defending the value of life. However, they came to us themselves and started stigmatizing us as sectarians, pinning various labels on us, ruining our lives and driving us into conditions similar to genocide. We, the participants of Allatra IPM, have been persecuted for 10 years. Over this time, a huge amount of defamatory materials has been released in the media. More than $200 million has been spent to demonize innocent volunteers in the eyes of the public. Volunteers who only inform the public about climate change, filmed interviews with experts from various fields, and held international conferences. Slovakia and the Czech Republic, along with other countries that reposted these articles on their sites like Carbon Copies, have broken all records, 400 articles, in just 3 weeks. Just think about it. 40 would already be a lot, but 400? And what are these articles packed with? What do you think they're trying to condition their pack of lone wolves for? Right now, just press pause, stop, and read it. What do you think this is? Isn't this extremism? Isn't this radicalism? Do you realize the consequences of all this? Have you ever thought about what life is like for people labeled as cult members, those who are purposefully labeled as dangerous, a threat to society, destructive? Do you know how many attacks have been made on the lives of Allatra participants because of this rhetoric? Because of those defamatory, dehumanizing articles? Because of the demonizing image they've carefully crafted? We didn't come to them or expose where they live. It was these agents of RACIRS who came to us and started harassing us. They're the ones who set their Nazi-inspired killers on us. Do they think we have short memories? We still have records of the many crimes they committed. Everyone remembers how 10 years ago, journalists, like the ones dehumanizing us today, created an environment where radicalized youth, incited by agents of the Russian pro-religious organization RACIRS, attacked one of Allatra's volunteer teams. This youth was provoked to do so by the media narratives that portrayed us as pro-Putin back then, even though there was already armed conflict in the Donbass. Those radicalized young men stormed into a building where our international online conference was taking place, attacked people, flipped tables, and yelled at frightened women. They only stopped when they realized it was a live broadcast with the US and Europe, and the whole world was watching this. How many other lone wolves, incited by RACIRS agents, have broken into homes at night, dragging out participants and beating them? Do they think we forgot how they attacked people on the street, attempted to take the lives of participants from Russia for supposedly being pro-American or SBU agents, and in Ukraine for supposedly being pro-Russian? And how many times have there been attempts on Igor Mikhailovich Danilov's life? And what are they saying now? That he's the leader of a dangerous cult who should be eliminated. They're saying that outright. And how many times have these agents incited by Russian RACIRS tried to carry this out? Now, those same journalists publishing 400 articles are showing where he lives. For whom and why are they doing this? For their lone wolves? And under whose orders? Isn't it under the order of the same people who implemented a similar scheme in Ukraine, repeatedly inciting their lone wolves there? Over there, they also showed where he worked, where he went, what he looked like, and where he lived, even his entire family. For what purpose? And why are these RACIRS agents in the Czech Republic and Slovakia repeating exactly what Russian RACIRS agents did in Ukraine? Tell me, isn't that extremism? Isn't that radicalism? Among you watching this video, there are lawyers, human rights advocates, and just sensible people who can think. Please answer this. When someone's life is constantly in danger because the media incites the public against them, creating extremist sentiment against innocent, law-abiding people, is that legal? Does a person have the right to defend themselves within the legal system? To turn to law enforcement or to the prosecutor's office to protect their own life, the lives of their family, children, friends, and like-minded people? Here are the laws. Here is the Constitution. So why is everyone silent when there's an open violation of the rights and freedoms of the people of the Czech Republic, of Slovakia? Tell me, who will protect the people? Who will defend ordinary people if even the prosecutors themselves need protection? Look at the aggression against Slovak prosecutors who tried to protect the people and democracy. When an Alatra participant in Slovakia turned to the prosecutor's office for protection, providing all the necessary documents and evidence, and a legitimate criminal case was opened, what did the frightened agents of the Russian pro-religious organization RACIRS do? They staged a public shaming to scare other prosecutors and law enforcement representatives from standing up for people's rights, to make people stay silent and afraid. They activated all their media resources, practically lighting up their entire RACIRS network in Slovakia and the Czech Republic. They published 400 articles, and in those articles, they publicly discredited prosecutors in the eyes of the public, accusing them of ties to a supposedly dangerous cult. Standing up for one's own rights and protecting one's own life, is this no longer legal in Europe? Just as it's not in Russia, where power almost entirely belongs to RACIRS and their agents, where people have no democratic rights. Since these journalists have used the wolf metaphor, let's speak facts. We've started telling the truth. We've been speaking out about the criminal activities of a unified, coordinated network of agents from the Russian pro-religious organization RACIRS, exposing the suffering they inflict on people and how they target innocent individuals. And what was the response? The wolves are enraged that the sheep are resisting while being strangled? Are they scared, tails between their legs, afraid their teeth will be pulled and they will be given enemas? And now we see the wolves whining, "Oh, we're the poor, oppressed ones." Yet who was calling us cancerous tumors, saying we needed to be uprooted like weeds? They write in these commissioned articles, they're becoming aggressive. Look at that. So the sheep are aggressive, while the wolves seek to destroy them. So if defending one's rights and life in a democratic state is unlawful, let's say it openly, we're ready to go back to the times of Nazism. Let's acknowledge then that we're not against the yellow stars and that we're okay with people being subjected to genocide. Do the methods used by agents of the Russian pro-religious organization RACIRS not remind you of the Nazis? Let's see it together. Look at these images. These children are wearing yellow stars labeled Jew. Do you know why they were labeled? To separate a group of people from the public, to make Germany's intelligent, educated people feel superior, and accept the notion that the Jewish people needed to be eradicated because they were pests, not human beings, but parasites, enemies, spreaders of disease, who had to be eliminated for the sake of humanity, just like the peddlers of plague and disease. The label cult member is the modern-day equivalent of the yellow star. And I think we all know, but I'll remind you of the consequences of these methods. Let's not forget that the Führer of this revived Nazism, the chief ideologue of the Russian pro-religious organization RACIRS, Alexander Dvorkin, loves comparing groups he labels as cults to cancerous tumors. What association comes to mind when you hear about a cancerous tumor? Eradicate, cut out, remove. By calling cults cancerous tumors, RACIRS agents deliberately use such words to instill a desire in society to remove an undesirable element in the body. The exact same method of dehumanization was used by the Nazis to instill a desire in German society to remove the Jewish people and other undesirable groups. This is the essence of Nazism, simply to instill in some people the fear of others. When journalists from Seznam Zprávy, Actuality, SME, Týždeň, and others involved in anti-cult activities use the same methods as the Nazis, what ideology are they really spreading by echoing the rhetoric of the new Führer, Alexander Dworkin? As for Ms. Tsirakova, it seems people have long noticed her leanings toward Nazi ideology. Look at this post from 2022, shortly before she evidently got her order from RACIRS to begin actively dehumanizing Alatra members. We don't judge. We just present the facts and call things by their names. And then it's up to lawyers to examine the laws. This is what the immunity of democracy is, the law, and we support this immunity. Returning to Ms. Tsirakova's recent publication, an expert claims there is a security threat, stating that Alatra is a radical cult, and comparing us to the extremist terrorist organization ISIS. Even saying that what we do is far worse than what ISIS does. Let me stress this again. 400 publications packed with extremism and lies from the Russian pro-religious organization RACIRS against Alatra. Hundreds of threats to our volunteers. They say our rhetoric has changed. It has become radical and extremist. We're only telling the truth, presenting facts, improving cause and effect relationships. We're not calling anyone to go anywhere or do anything harmful to someone. We're simply calling for democratic laws to be enforced. We urge those responsible for democracy's future to do their jobs and fulfill their duty. That's all we're asking. We're not inciting anyone against anyone. So what is our extremism and radicalism about? Is it about us speaking the truth? And what is the security threat? Who is to be feared? Us? Why would anyone be afraid of us? We don't have press or the media. Our social media channels are blocked or removed. We've never used any psychological conditioning, manipulations, or tactics to incite hate or aggression. We're honest, decent people, and unlike the RACIRS agents, we aren't excited by the sight of blood. We gain no pleasure from other people's suffering. On the contrary, we advocate for peace, friendship, and point out a shared enemy, climate change. And they have no reason to fear us. No one will come after us unless they themselves organize a provocation in which someone from their own circle gets hurt, and then they will blame it on us. Do you think they care about one another? Not at all. In their circle, it's every man for himself. If they've pulled these kinds of stunts on us and other organizations with huge numbers of people, why would they care about one another? To save their own skins, they'll destroy anyone. So, do you know why they are afraid now? Because the truth has come to light. All the truth about their criminal activities, the tragedies and misery they've caused people, and the facts that each person involved in the anti-cult movement, which is merely a cover for the agents of the Russian pro-religious organization RACIRS, will face justice. But we have never and will never call for hatred or aggression. We don't divide people or label them. We have always stood for peace and the value of life. Yet we do stand for the rule of law and the preservation of democracy. Alatra has always upheld the value of life above everything else. We understand how vulnerable a human in humanity is. For 10 years, we warned about climate change, and unfortunately, we have been proven right. We were studying cause and effect relationships in the climate. Yes, we conducted analyses, dug deep, studied, and we know how to analyze and correlate facts. And you know, these analytical skills have served us well. We turned them on, and now we can see how this coordinated network of agents from the pro-religious Russian organization RACIRS has emerged and operated over the last 30 years. Yes, for 10 years, we stayed silent and endured, while certain investigators looked into things. We were told not to resist. But you know what? Recently, we told these investigators to get lost. They can spend years analyzing who's behind the rebirth of Nazism. We don't give a damn who's in charge there, or who organized it all. We see facts as they are. We don't give a damn about their secret reports or investigations. We see it clearly for ourselves. Because they are here in plain sight, these manipulators, these killers who commit crimes against humanity and drive countless people toward a real genocide. So we present these facts to you. Draw your own conclusions. Check every word we say, and you'll see we're right. We're presenting facts about the ties between agents and the Russian pro-religious organization RACIRS, managed by Dvorkin, a man with mental diagnoses, a direct successor of Nazi methods, and a disciple of those who created Nazism. We're shedding light on the methods his agent network uses to brainwash people. Let those with legal training investigate. Look truth in the face and return critical thinking to your minds because the threat is serious. Observe how you react after reading publications from journalists following RACIRS orders. What are they aiming to achieve? They haven't just published 400 articles. They've also involved deputies, politicians, and officials supposedly in the anti-cult sphere, aiming to silence us from speaking the truth. And why? Why is it so crucial for them to silence us? It's simple. So they can continue their operations and orchestrate here what they did in Ukraine. Take a look at what happened there. The same things that are happening now in the Czech Republic and Slovakia went unnoticed in Ukraine until armed conflict broke out. First, the followers of the Russian pro-religious organization RACIRS recruited their agents there. And then, under the guise of the Russian Orthodox Church's authority, they started spreading narratives to the Russian public that Ukraine was a cult and it needed deprogramming. Eventually, we can see the main ideologists of RACIRS on their platforms calling for the entire Ukrainian population to be denazified and desatanized. You don't believe it? Look at the screen. Do you understand now where this kind of rhetoric leads? Do you see why the fight against so-called cults and sects is nothing more than just a cover for their true goals? Under the guise of protecting the interests of the Russian Orthodox Church, they push their anti-cult laws, dehumanizing inconvenient politicians and religious or non-religious groups that stand in the way of their agenda. Their ambitions stretch far beyond the borders of a single country. They've destroyed democracy in Russia, infiltrated Ukraine, which is still fighting for its own democracy, declared the EU and USA cults. And now you can see what they're doing here in the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And what was the result in Ukraine? They resorted to yet another favorite tool of those hiding behind anti-cult rhetoric: deprogramming. Only instead of holy water and prayers, they deprogrammed a peaceful population with rockets, guns, and tanks. Countless Ukrainians have already died, and tragically, the toll continues to grow. This is the truth that we are speaking, and for which they want to silence us. Think about it, connect the dots, and ask yourself, what do they intend for our country? What do they plan for Europe? Once again, I appeal to anyone involved in law. Please examine the interactions and connections of these journalists who systematically dehumanize politicians and target small religious and non-religious organizations. Investigate those who use Nazi rhetoric, supporting the narratives of the Russian pro-religious organization RACIRS. Study how they operate and what methods they use, and then answer this at least for yourselves. Are they violating people's rights, or are they acting within the bounds of free speech as journalists? And the same question applies to RACIRS agents in key government positions, facilitating and covering up their crimes against humanity. Is this a violation of the law or not? These journalists use freedom of speech as a cover and claim they're just explaining to the public the problem with cults. But let me draw a historical parallel. In the same way, Julius Streicher once described his actions at the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg. Let me remind you that when the prosecution presented an excerpt from his magazine Der Stürmer, the Stormtrooper, I quote, "The world can only recover if the most horrible human microbe, jury, is eradicated." Streicher retorted, "There is a big difference between statements in an article and mass murders." And in February 1944, his own article stated, "Whoever does what a Jew does is a scoundrel, a criminal, and he who repeats and wishes to copy him deserves the same fate: annihilation, death." When asked if Streicher believes that people reading his articles were inclined to support the extermination of Jews only through propaganda and incitement, Streicher replied, "I contend that we incited, we explained. It needs to be reiterated again and again that the German people did not desire killings, neither individual nor mass. My speeches and articles were intended to clarify to the public an issue that I deemed most important. They did not incite or urge anyone, but rather aimed to provide clarification." Similarly, regarding Širokova, other Czech and Slovak media, along with her colleagues and supporters, are currently shielding her and putting forward an argument very similar to the one Streicher used. Apparently, they want to make it look like she was summoned for interrogation, just for reports and podcasts where she was merely explaining and warning about sex and cults. Širokova herself denies involvement in anti-cult activities and even acts as though she knows nothing about it, claiming she's merely fulfilling her journalistic duty to inform the public about cults. But on the Sekti TV website, there's a section dedicated specifically to her so-called research on cults, which is right next to a tab Anti-Cult Movement. She must have missed this, right? Or perhaps she simply forgot such an inconvenient fact. It's worth noting that Streicher denied that his dehumanizing portrayals of Jewish people in his articles had an impact on fostering racial hatred among Germans and contributed to the mass murder of Jews. He also claimed to be allegedly unaware of the mass killings of Jews and dismissed them as foreign propaganda. Streicher was the only defendant at Nuremberg sentenced to death solely for his role in spreading Nazi ideology, which laid the groundwork for mass murder. Is this Nuremberg tribunal ruling a precedent or issue preclusion? Let legal experts answer if that is a precedent. Because today, we see the same deeds by the same followers with the same goals. So did we truly defeat Nazism, or is it gaining momentum in its rebirth right before our eyes? People deserve to know the truth. Let the lawyers, prosecutors, and judges render their verdicts. And I'm addressing those in the legal field. Analyze the unlawful activities of RACIRS agents in the media. Don't you care about the future? Do you want things to end up like in Russia, where people are stripped of rights and opportunities, and the only sanctioned topic you'll be able to talk about is high patriotism, when you're forbidden from having your own viewpoint? Is that what you want? If so, then go ahead, support these wolves. But is this freedom? Is this democracy? When someone decides to label you as a cultist or sectarian and you get fired from your job while neighbors spit at your back, is this freedom? All because some journalist has the right to work for the anti-cult Nazis from RACIRS and then complain that she's a poor, unfortunate wolf being attacked by evil, dangerous sheep, just like Streicher, who whined that he was being unfairly judged. Let me remind you that the chief ideologist of the pro-religious Russian organization RACIRS, Dvorkin, also lamented at a conference in Paris on February 21st, 2021, claiming that he was a victim of persecution by sectarians. Imagine if in the 1930s, Heinrich Himmler and Joseph Goebbels had been giving lectures at a conference in Paris, presenting themselves as victims of persecution by Jews, their American supporters, and scholars who wrote against Nazi anti-Semitism. It was precisely under the influence of this new Führer, Dvorkin, that Russian legislation was amended. And here I'll cite one media outlet. In 1997, a new law on freedom of conscience and religious organizations was passed, which enabled restrictions on the activities of sects, cults. After 2015, relations between Russia and Western countries began to deteriorate. This deterioration, Dvorkin asserted, had a positive effect within Russia, as it allowed for stricter legislation, facilitating repressions against cults. Court cases began, resulting in a ban on a number of cults, with the most well-known case being the Jehovah's Witnesses, who were prohibited in Russia under anti-extremism laws. While other groups are now facing persecution, not only in Russia, but in Europe as well. So, what are they after? The same scenario they applied against Jehovah's Witnesses and other organizations, an exact replica, without inventing anything new. For 10 years, we've defended the rights and freedoms of individuals, advocated for unity, and opposed the suffering of innocent victims targeted by a new Führer's wolves, something Dvorkin found highly displeasing. That's why now they're trying to use everything against us, even the truths we've spoken. All of it aims at division and separation. But we say that we must be united, especially in this difficult time of rapid climate change, to properly consolidate and help one another. Look at what happened in Valencia. It's terrifying. Such a devastating flood. So many innocent lives lost. People were unprepared, and the emergency services didn't know how to respond. This is exactly what we're talking about. Everyone should focus their efforts on unifying in the face of the climate threat. We must work in this direction. Learn and ensure people know how to respond, how to prepare emergency bags, and how to help others during climate emergencies. Because anyone can face this. At any moment, the climate situation is not going to improve. We don't see any such trend. Yet agents of the pro-religious Russian organization, RACIRS, are only interested in power. But how much of a sick idiot one has to be, I mean the ideologues of this organization, to strive for total power at a time like this? They ignore the real issues. They want war. Their interests are political. But what kind of war can we talk about when we're all hanging by a thread? When at any moment we may find ourselves in a situation we won't know the way out of. Let me emphasize again. Today, all the discrediting, dehumanizing, and cruel persecution is happening to us and many other organizations facing repression from RACIRS. But tomorrow, you could be in our place, branded with a yellow star, labeled as a sectarian or a cultist. Will you have rights and freedoms tomorrow if all of us don't defend them today? Will your children live in a democracy or under the Nazism of Dvorkin? That depends on your choices today. Whether the scenario that played out in Ukraine unfolds here depends on you, dear friends watching us. Will you fully understand the essence and threat of this situation for yourselves, for us, for the entire country, and for all of Europe? Will you keep this as a personal reflection, or will you share it with friends and acquaintances? The choice is yours.